Whanganui Iwi, Whanganui Kaitoke Prison and northern part of Wanganui Forest on account settlement bill interrupted debate on second reading.
I call the Honourable Marion Street.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's my pleasure to get up and speak in this interrupted second reading of the Whanganui Iwi, Whanganui Kaitoke Prison and northern part of Wanganui Forest on account settlement bill. Mr Speaker, this is another piece of legislation that gives legislative import to a Treaty of Waitangi settlement. This, again, as we have seen before, is legislation which commenced prior to the introduction of the bill itself. The bill was introduced by this government in August of 2009 and had its first reading in November of 2009, but clearly many of its contents derive from an earlier history and some negotiations. I want to acknowledge the work done by the previous Labour government, and I want to acknowledge also, as we do repeatedly on these occasions, the work of the current Minister of Treaty Negotiations in his bringing this legislation to the House from its inception to this point of second reading. Mr Speaker, the Labour Party supports this legislation. It is about the transfer of assets in an on-account settlement of historical claims of the Whanganui Iwi. Mr Speaker, the substance of the bill simply puts into law an agreement that was made in principle and I suppose codifies in legislative form an agreement arrived at between Whanganui Iwi and the Crown. The preamble to this legislation describes some of the content of the bill. Basically, it says that this agreement between the Crown and the Southern Whanganui Cluster, Tūpoho, Working Party, to enter into an on-account settlement was an outcome of discussions between Northern Ngāti Apa and the Working Party about aspects of the Ngāti Apa settlement package. Now, that was contained in the agreement in principle between Ngāti Apa of the North Island and the Crown in their original agreement in principle. Ngāti Apa went through the process, Mr Speaker, of consulting with neighbouring iwi on the agreement in principle, and what we have now is the result of that. It does transfer ownership of land, and it transfers the ownership of Crown Forest land, in particular in one part of the Whanganui Forest, that is the northern part of the Whanganui Forest. Mr Speaker, I'm always particularly pleased when Treaty of Waitangi settlements come to this House for codifying in law when they include bits of Crown Forest. My interest in this area goes back some years, and my work as a trustee on the Crown Forestry's Rental Trust. And nothing gives me greater pleasure as an ex-trustee of the Crown Forestry Rentals Trust than to see that map of Crown Forests diminishing and going back to what are usually the rightful owners of the land, or without exception, the rightful owners of that land, proven by claims before Waitangi Tribunal and knitted together as part of historical treaty settlements. And as that map diminishes, Mr Speaker, I'm heartened, and it gives me great cause for optimism, that the historical treaty processes will be behind us in short order. The government wishes that all historical treaty negotiations should be concluded by 2014, and I seriously wish them well in that respect, and certainly there will not be any unnecessary objection on the part of the Labour Party to derail or hold up any of those Treaty of Waitangi settlements, as long as they are fair and as long as they address the grievances which various iwi bring to the table. Mr. Speaker, it's important that even with the transfer across of this small part, this northern part of the Whanganui forest, that there is some addressing of old grievances. Typically, in these circumstances, Mr. Speaker, we find the iwi being more generous than they could be with respect to settlements and transfers of land and assets because of the huge injustices that were done in the past. But in a spirit of goodwill and the wish to move this country forward and get past the iwi-kiwi nonsense that characterised former campaigns, the Māori frequently do not exact everything that they might exact from the Crown. It's interesting, Mr. Speaker, that the Select Committee in its report back of this piece of legislation said that they only had minor technical amendments to make, but they did seem to get embroiled for some time in the spelling of Whanganui. And I cannot speak to this without drawing attention to that. If the House remembers correctly, on the 18th of December in 2009, the Minister of Land Information decided, after the Geographic Board had put a bit of a conundrum to him, had decided that Crown agencies would adopt the spelling of Whanganui with an H over time. And he made that decision on the 18th of December 2009, largely because it was close to Christmas and most people would have gone home. However, the Select Committee says that it felt very strongly, in fact it's written those words in its report on the bill, that it felt very strongly about this issue and that it in fact chose to put the H into Whanganui, except where there were, in one instance, I think only one instance in the bill in Clause 4, where there is an historical reference to a piece of legislation that had Wanganui without the H in it, in the title, and so they have left it there as a correct historical record. But from now on, clearly in this legislation, the Select Committee has recommended, by changing and amending the legislation, that Whanganui with an H shall be the legal record of this transfer of assets. And I welcome that. I think that is a good response for the Select Committee to make, and I commend them for making those amendments. Mr. Speaker, this takes us another step forward in the process, and it is a welcome step. Every time when we get to the end of this process of treaty settlements, there is a celebration. We are in the mid-stages right now, and I look forward to this proceeding without further ado and getting forward to the third reading of this bill in short order. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Tauhana Hari.